Welcome to video number 8 in a Dispy primer on Christian nationalism. Now, this is the second of a trio of videos that I'm looking at under the banner of Dispies and New Testament priority. And what I mean by that is many of us dispensationalists, we would acknowledge a text like 2 Timothy 3 that all scripture is inspired and profitable for teaching and for training, for correction and reproof. And while we give verbal assent to that, we don't actually live that way, particularly as it relates to culture and politics in contemporary society. This gets manifest when dispensationalists say things like, well, we don't see Jesus engaging in politics or trying to influence culture. We don't see the apostles telling us how to engage in politics. We don't see the apostles trying to pull the levers of society to change culture. And the logic behind that then is really a New Testament priority, as if the Old Testament just isn't of any value for such matters. And that ought not be, especially for the dispensationalist. We are the ones who really have a great continuity between Old and New Testaments. We recognize we're not those under the Mosaic covenant, and the church is a distinct entity, but there's a lot of continuity in our understanding of God's revealed will for man. So let's just consider this maybe in a little bit more detail. The fact of the matter is, every true Christian looks to Christ for his example. Jesus is our example. But how we understand the function and the content of that example is important. And we all know that Jesus was sent to do things that we were never sent to do. He, as the God man, was able to do things that we're not able to do. Right. So Jesus was sent to preach that the kingdom is at hand. He was sent to raise the dead and to heal the sick. He was to live as a Jew under the law and in submission to the Roman Empire with no citizenship. He was to offer himself as a substitutionary sacrifice. Nevertheless, this doesn't stop people from appealing to Jesus for their political theology. Think about this. Jesus wasn't sent to have a wife with conjugal relations, becoming one flesh with her, to grow old with her and her infirmities, to ensure her long-term care while seeking to prefer her over himself in the things of this world. We're not going to find that example from him. He wasn't sent to raise children with all that that entails. He wasn't sent to show us how to discipline a 3-year-old or lead family worship. He wasn't sent to excel at a trade or to teach it to his children so that they'd be self-supporting, productive members of society. He wasn't sent to oversee the education of children. He wasn't sent to discern the pros and cons of a secular state-run education and to decide between that or a private school or homeschooling. He wasn't sent to consider being on the local school board. We won't find that example from him or from any of the apostles. He wasn't sent to be the sole breadwinner of his family and to ensure that after he died, his wife and children would be taken care of. We're not going to learn about life insurance or wills from him. We're not going to go to the New Testament to look to Jesus to find out what kind of car to buy. He's not going to teach us about eating organic. No social media model, no views on watching football, American or otherwise. And to be fair, most people would never claim that he did give us examples in those areas. And that's exactly my point, though. Why do so many keep looking to the example of Jesus of how to be the best citizen in a constitutional republic? Jesus was a Jew. He lived under the law. He lived as a subject in the Roman Empire. He did not possess citizenship. He never held the office of voter. Probably every person hearing my voice lives in a very different context. We cannot look to Jesus for an example on voting. Why? Because he never lived in a society where they voted for their civil leaders. He never held the office of voter. You and I have been appointed by God to hold the office of voter, and we will give an account for our stewardship. That concept was simply foreign to him. You and I possess citizenship in our country. Jesus did not. We enjoy all the rights and responsibilities of being a citizen. Jesus did not. He never bore the responsibility of choosing the local mayor for Nazareth. He didn't get to choose the governor of Judea. He had no vote in who would be the next Caesar. He was never going to be accountable for such things. We will. Paul had the rights of citizenship. We have two examples of him using those rights, but not Jesus. Jesus didn't have to think through voting. He was not going to be held accountable for that stewardship. He didn't live in a nation where there was a supreme civil law of the land that he could point civil leaders to. Rome didn't have a constitution or a Bill of Rights. He had no input on what the content of the law of the land would be. His neighbors had no say in the law of the land. Jesus had the obligation to love his neighbor as himself, which he fulfilled perfectly, but that never included considering the laws his neighbor would be under. He was not his brother's keeper in that way, like you and I are. Jesus never had to think about how a particular bill might affect the ability of his children to work. He didn't have to think through what would happen if his neighbor voted for a particular politician, or what would happen to his neighbor if a particular politician was voted in. He had no say, and he had no accountability to God for such a stewardship. And the same simply cannot be said of us. So if we're not going to look to Jesus on life insurance or what car to buy, why would we look to him on voting? Why should we seek his example in interacting with elected officials when he never interacted with an elected official? There were no elected officials in his time under the Roman Empire. So if we're not going to find in the New Testament arguments for or against eating organic, buying a hybrid car, why would we look to Jesus on how to be the most loving neighbor in a constitutional republic? Listen, we've got to utilize the entirety of Scripture and abandon this New Testament priority that only looks to Jesus and the apostles. Now, with that, I will add one more thing. A book you might consider: Christ's Kingdom Commission. Christ's Kingdom Commission, the foreword's written by John MacArthur, the author David Anderson, and he makes a really fascinating presentation in the beginning of the book. And I'm not saying he would agree with everything or even anything that I'm saying up to this point, but he points out that Paul, you study the book of Acts, Paul specifically targets capital cities. Legislative centers, if you will. He doesn't always go to the biggest city, the most populous city. He actually targets the capital cities. Why? Why does Paul go from capital to capital to capital? Why would Paul do such a thing? Was it because he just had a special place in his heart for civil magistrates? Or was there another reason? I'll leave that speculation to you, but consider picking up the book and giving it a read. And even more than that, consider abandoning this New Testament priority that looks to Jesus and the apostles for examples that just aren't supposed to be there in the first place.